In 1658, Copenhagen should have fallen. The sea was frozen. Land routes were cut. The city was isolated, starving, and completely outmatched. Yet they defeated the most feared army in Europe. Copenhagen, 1658. The Swedish army advanced into Denmark. They tightened the siege, cutting the city off from the outside world. No ships, no supplies, no escape. King Charles X, Gustav did not come to negotiate. He came to erase Denmark's future. Inside the walls, no one believed in victory. There was only one decision. Civilians became soldiers, homes became fortifications. Church bells were melted into artillery metal. Then on a freezing night, Swedish troops crossed the ice, convinced the city would collapse. But the unexpected happened. The first cannon fired at point-blank range. Musket fire tore through formations trapped on the ice. Men slipped and were trampled by their own comrades. Ladders went up and came crashing down, soaked in blood. The fighting dissolved into chaos. Hand-to-hand combat, breath against breath, on frozen ground. By dawn, the assault had failed. Copenhagen still stood, and history had just changed direction. At that time, Europe was a dangerous place. For years, nations fought constantly for power. They wanted land. They wanted wealth. And most of all, they wanted control of trade. Trade required ships. Ships required open seas. And one sea mattered more than all others: the Baltic Sea. Grain, timber, iron, and weapons moved through these waters. Whoever controlled the Baltic grew rich, fast. Sweden wanted that control. Over time, Sweden became stronger than its neighbors. They built a disciplined army. Soldiers were trained to move quickly and obey orders without question. Officers learned how to plan and command large forces. Swedish leaders believed power came from action. If something stood in their way, force was the answer. And Denmark stood in the way. Denmark controlled key ports and narrow sea routes near the Baltic. As long as Denmark held them, Sweden could not dominate trade. So war broke out. Sweden struck first and struck hard. By 1658, Denmark was overwhelmed. Its army exhausted, its defenses broken. It was forced to accept a deeply unfavorable peace. Denmark lost territory, lost vital ports. Many believed the country was finished, but one thing remained standing. Copenhagen, the capital, the seat of government, the source of command. As long as Copenhagen remained free, Denmark still existed. The Swedish king understood this perfectly. To him, the war was not over. Peace meant nothing if Copenhagen still stood. As long as the capital survived, Denmark could recover. So he chose to continue the war. And then everything began moving with quiet precision. No grand declarations, no loud threats, only silent preparation. The Swedish army regrouped methodically. Soldiers returned to their units. Discipline tightened further. Everyone knew their place and their role. Next came the weapons. Every musket was cleaned, every sword sharpened. Artillery was inspected again and again, until officers were certain it could function in the brutal winter conditions. Because the campaign would take place in winter, logistics became critical. Food was gathered from farms and storehouses. Grain, dried meat, and gunpowder were loaded onto heavy wagons. Everything was calculated to last. Horses were cared for as carefully as soldiers. They were fed well, allowed to rest before the march. Everyone understood one truth. Without horses, the guns would not move. And without the guns, the siege would fail. Each evening, Swedish officers gathered around maps. They traced snow-covered roads, marked frozen rivers, selected campsites and supply points. They were not in a hurry. They were not seeking a quick victory. Their goal was control of movement, control of food, and ultimately, control of time. The plan was simple: surround Copenhagen, cut off all outside support, wait for the city to weaken. When the Swedish army began its march, winter had already taken hold. Snow covered the roads, movement slowed, rivers froze into hard paths. Still, the army advanced. Day by day, step by step, closing in, and ahead of them, silent in the cold, Copenhagen waited. This time the news was no longer uncertain. The Swedish army had assembled. They had left their camps, and they were marching directly toward Copenhagen. Once this was confirmed, the city understood. Everything was about to change. There were no screams in the streets, no panicked crowds. Instead, there was an unnatural silence. The silence of people who knew they had no choice but to prepare. Copenhagen's leaders met constantly in the early days. They did not argue for long. They did not search for risky solutions. They knew their enemy well. The Swedish army was large, well-armed, experienced in sieges. Meeting them in open battle would mean certain defeat. So the decision was made quickly. Copenhagen would not fight outside the walls. Copenhagen would hold the city and prepare for a long siege. From that moment on, the entire city shifted into defensive mode. The first task was reorganizing manpower. Veteran soldiers were gathered and assigned to the walls. They were not scattered. They were placed according to a clear plan. Each man knew where to stand, which direction to watch, and how to respond once the artillery began firing. Those who had never carried weapons were not pushed aside. They were given specific essential tasks. Some moved ammunition, some repaired fortifications. Others carried food and water to the guards. Copenhagen was no longer an ordinary city. It was becoming a defensive machine. Once manpower was organized, attention turned fully to the walls. Every section was inspected from base to top. No detail was ignored. Old cracks were carefully filled. Weak stone was reinforced with packed earth and heavy timber. Where exposed sections were strengthened. At the most vulnerable points, materials were piled high to absorb artillery fire. Watchtowers were reinforced with extra guards. Shifts were shortened. No gaps were allowed, day or night. The gates became the most heavily protected points. All gates were sealed. Wooden doors reinforced in layers. Iron chains pulled tight inside. There was no free movement anymore. Even those with permission were checked thoroughly. The city isolated itself, not out of fear, but discipline and survival. Behind the walls stood the artillery. Cannons were hauled to the highest positions. Each gun was preset to precise firing angles. Ammunition was stacked nearby, protected from cold and moisture. No test shots, no wasted fire. Every round was saved for moments that truly mattered. And once the defenses were ready, the greatest concern became clear. Food. Storehouses were opened and inventories taken from scratch. Grain, dried meat, salt, clean water. Everything was recorded. No guessing, no hiding. Rations were calculated for weeks, then recalculated for months. The population was told the truth. Food would be scarce. Life would be harder. But if order was maintained, the city could endure. In residential districts, daily life began to change. Meals grew smaller. Fires were kept low. Lights went out earlier at night. People spoke more quietly, not out of fear, but because they were listening. Listening for movement beyond the walls. Listening for cannon fire. Then the first signs appeared. Smoke on the horizon. Campfires glowing at night. Slow movement along the roads leading toward the city. The Swedish army was approaching. Inside the walls, no one asked anymore whether war would come. Only one question remained. When the siege would begin, Copenhagen was ready. Not to win quickly, not to strike outward, but to stand, to endure, and to enter the days ahead when silence would end and the first cannon would fire. When the Swedish army reached Copenhagen, the war did not begin immediately. For the first few days, both sides only watched each other. Outside the walls, the Swedish army built its camps with methodical precision. Tents rose in orderly rows. Cannons were dragged into position. Supply lines were secured and guarded tightly. There were no rushed attacks, no impulsive moves. The Swedish forces took their time measuring distances. They studied the walls. They noted the gates, the watchtowers, and the weaker sections of the defenses. Nothing was overlooked. Inside Copenhagen, the atmosphere grew heavier. From the walls, civilians could see the enemy clearly. They saw the tents. They saw the artillery. They saw the banners moving in the cold wind. War was no longer news, it was right in front of them. The early days passed in tense silence. During the day, both sides observed each other. At night, the sound of hammers and shovels echoed outside the walls. The Swedish army dug trenches. They built fortifications. They advanced slowly, deliberately, toward the city. Inside the walls, the defenders did not rest. Guards rotated through the night. Cannons were kept loaded. All gates remained sealed. The population began to feel the true weight of the siege, not through blood, but through waiting. Then on a freezing morning, the silence was broken. A single cannon fired from the Swedish lines, not to breach the walls, but to test the response. The shot landed near the fortifications. Earth and stone exploded into the air. Almost immediately, Copenhagen's guns answered. The sound thundered across the city, and the war had officially begun. In the first days, the fighting was scattered but constant. Artillery on both sides fired in waves, not to destroy the walls outright, but to apply pressure and wear the enemy down. The Swedish army advanced with caution. They did not rush the walls. They continued digging trenches, continued building fortifications, continued pulling their guns closer. Every meter gained cost, time, and effort. Inside the city, the defenders watched every small change. They repaired damage as soon as it appeared. They reinforced the walls during the night. No damage was allowed to remain until morning. The population slowly grew accustomed to the sound of artillery. At first, every explosion caused fear. Later, it became part of daily life. Windows shook, walls trembled, but the city held. The opening days of the siege brought no decisive outcome. Neither side gained a clear advantage. Yet with every passing day, the pressure increased. The Swedish lines crept closer. Copenhagen grew more tense. The war had begun, but this was only the beginning. And both sides knew that what lay ahead would be far more brutal. After the initial probing days, the siege entered a new phase. The Swedish army maintained its familiar approach. They advanced slowly. They dug trenches. They moved their artillery forward meter by meter. With each passing day, they believed the distance was shrinking, and that time was on their side. Inside Copenhagen, the defenders understood one thing clearly. If they only stood on the walls and waited, they would be worn down. Artillery would break the walls piece by piece. Fatigue would break morale. So they decided not to defend passively. They chose the kind of fighting their enemy least expected. They struck at night. They struck quickly. And they did not stay to fight for long. When darkness fell, the city went silent. No lights, no loud sounds. Then through small side gates and hidden passages, our defensive units slipped out. They moved in very small groups, only a few men at a time. Each knew exactly what he had to do. They did not seek large engagements. They searched for weaknesses. A Swedish unit digging trenches was attacked without warning. A guard post was overrun in seconds. A supply depot was set on fire, throwing part of the camp into chaos. After each strike, the defenders withdrew immediately. No pursuit, no attempt to hold ground. By the time Swedish troops reacted, the attackers had vanished into the darkness. These attacks were not large. There was no thunder of artillery, no mass charges, but they happened again and again. And that repetition began to create pressure. The Swedish army was forced to change its routine. More guards were assigned. Rest periods grew shorter. No one slept through the night anymore. By day, trenches were still dug and fortifications built. By night, every direction had to be watched. Fatigue began to take hold. At the same time, the defenders paid a price as well. Not every raid succeeded. Some groups did not return intact. At times, they narrowly avoided being surrounded in the dark. Every sortie beyond the walls was a gamble, and everyone knew it, yet they continued. Because every small strike slowed the enemy, every supply depot destroyed bought time, and every sleepless night weakened Swedish morale just a little more. Gradually, signs of strain appeared on both sides. The defenders were exhausted, sleep-deprived, Shortages became more noticeable. The Swedish army no longer carried its early confidence. Supply lines were disrupted. Units had to be spread out to guard every direction. The sense of complete safety inside the camps was gone. Neither side gained a clear advantage, but the atmosphere had changed. This was no longer a slow, methodical siege. It had become a test of endurance. Both sides understood the days ahead would be harsher. The attacks would grow larger, and the cost would be far higher. The war continued, and this was only the opening chapter. After weeks of attrition, the siege no longer followed Sweden's original plan. The defenders' constant small attacks had left clear marks. Trenches were no longer dug as quickly. Supply depots required heavier guarding. Soldiers were exhausted from lack of sleep and sustained tension. Winter showed no mercy. Cold winds cut through the camps. Ice and mud slowed all movement. Wounded soldiers recovered slowly, if they recovered at all. Swedish commanders began to realize that time was no longer fully on their side. So they chose to strike one final blow. A major assault was prepared, with hopes of ending everything at once. Artillery fire intensified beyond anything before. The walls shook. Smoke blanketed the ground before Copenhagen. But when the Swedish troops advanced, nothing went as planned. The terrain was slick with mud and ice. Formations were difficult to maintain. Orders moved slowly through the thunder and smoke. The defenders reacted quickly and precisely. They fired down from above. They struck at weak points in the advancing formations. They denied the attackers any chance to regroup. The major assault began to lose momentum. Casualties mounted. Forward units were halted. Units behind them could not advance. When the final attack failed to produce results, a change swept through the Swedish camp. Quietly, but unmistakably, there were no more confident councils, no talk of taking the city within days. Instead, there were short, private, heavy exchanges between commanders. At last, the order was given, a full withdrawal. Not as a dramatic defeat, but as an acknowledgement that the siege could not continue. Frontline units began to receive orders to pull back, not in chaos, but in silence. Step by step, withdrawing, watching, guarding against sudden attacks from the city. Artillery was withdrawn first. Lighter guns that could still be moved were taken away. Heavier pieces that could not be withdrawn quickly were dismantled or destroyed to keep them from falling into enemy hands. Meanwhile, soldiers worked in the cutting cold, hands stiff with frost, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Yet formation was maintained, because everyone understood that withdrawal, at this stage, was no less dangerous than attack. At night, the fires in the camps grew fewer. Encampments once crowded with men became empty spaces. Roads once filled with marching feet now carried only the slow roll of supply wagons through mud and ice. From the walls, when Copenhagen's defenders saw everything, they did not cheer, they did not pursue far, they watched, and they held their positions, because they understood that it was patience that had brought the enemy to this moment. As the distance between the Swedish army and the city grew, the withdrawal was no longer temporary. It became a clear decision, organized, stage by stage. Each stage paused to regroup forces, to tend the wounded, and to ask whether the siege could continue. With each day of retreat, the answer became clearer. Supplies were insufficient to remain. The soldiers lacked strength for another assault. Morale was no longer what it had been, and winter was far from over. The Swedish army moved away from Copenhagen in order. Banners that once stood before the walls became small dots on the horizon, and the siege ended not in a single day of dramatic defeat, but through a series of difficult decisions made over time. Copenhagen still stood. Denmark was not broken, and the reasons for Sweden's failure became clear. They had underestimated the city's ability to endure. They believed pressure would force a quick collapse. It did not. The resilience of the defenders, their unexpected and flexible tactics, combined with brutal weather and logistical strain, forced a powerful army to withdraw. The war ended not because one side was destroyed, but because one side could no longer continue. And Copenhagen proved something important. There are battles where victory does not come from attacking, but from standing firm until the very end. When the Swedish army withdrew, Copenhagen was still standing. The city was damaged. Its walls were cracked. Its people were exhausted. But Copenhagen did not fall. For Denmark, this meant everything. It proved the country had not been broken. That a city, even when surrounded and starved, could defend itself if it refused to give up. The people of Copenhagen did not win through strength. They won through endurance, through discipline, and through the decision to keep the gates closed. For Sweden, the failure was a clear lesson. They had a powerful army, strong artillery, and deep experience in war, but they had misjudged their opponent. They failed to understand that the will of those defending a city can be stronger than cannon fire. After Copenhagen, warfare against cities was viewed differently. It was no longer only about numbers and weapons, but about time, supply, and morale. This siege is remembered not for a decisive victory, but for a city that refused to surrender. And that is Copenhagen's legacy. In war, sometimes the winner is simply the one who remains standing at the end.